Welcome to Week Old Beans, where we survey and talk about the week's news. Week Old Beans. It's a great name, right, Fowler?
Excellent name.
Yeah, if only somebody had come up with a genius idea to change the podcast earlier on.
No, we can't live in the past. We have to just keep moving on to the
Yeah,
present.
yeah, it's a shame we don't have audio records of somebody suggesting that. Anywho, damn it. Anywho, this is episode, I believe, 9 of Week Old Beans, where we recap and talk about the week's politics and other newsworthy events. This is a bit different today, though, because we're not really talking about something that's happened over an event that's happened over the past 7 days. We're really going to talk about a person. And this person has been making splashes in the media. Um, he's a political candidate on the Democratic side. He's one of three political candidates on the Democratic side. And it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK, the son of Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who was tragically assassinated uh, a little bit after his brother.
Robert
It,
Kennedy is a legendary figure in modern history because he was a New Deal Democrat who was for civil rights, anti the Vietnam War. In many ways, he was like the better. Uh, he's like what's that phrase? He was like the best case scenario of the Democrats. He represented before his death like the potential of the Democratic Party avoiding the Vietnam War, the Democratic Party pushing civil rights really early on. He was really a visionary, but we'll never really know what he could have done because obviously he was killed.
yes, and so his son, Robert Kennedy Jr., is running as a Democrat, and it's fascinating looking at the two of them. Um, Robert F. Kennedy, his main claim to fame, I would say, has been his opposition to. Uh, Now, I won't say that he is opposed to, and this is based on his words, that he is opposed to the the distribution and taking of vaccines, but I will say he's a vaccine skeptic. I feel like anti-vaxxer is I feel like it's not a nuanced enough descriptor, but he is definitely a vaccine skeptic, and he has kind of made vaccines and big pharma the cornerstone of his campaign. Um, and so, what Fowler and I wanted to really talk about, just pretty much for the entirety of this podcast, was the the tendency for populist leaders to essentially dabble in conspiracy theories. RFK is, he's been called a conspiracy theorist. He's been called a anti-vaxxer. He's been called many, many things. And some of those criticisms, I believe, are appropriate. He's touted, conspiracies that state that, his father was murdered by the CIA and that his uncle was also murdered by the CIA. He's definitely said some rather conspiratorial things about the nature of vaccines, specifically the COVID-19 vaccine, and the CDC and other government agencies. But he's also made environmentalism a key component of his campaign. And when you look at his record, he actually has a very solid record for prosecuting and uh, defending, indigenous sovereignty when it comes to pollution. I believe he is partially responsible, or maybe even fully responsible, for the major cleanup of the Hudson River that happened in the early 2000s. Um, so he has a very extensive track record as a prosecutor. He was actually being floated as to be the EPA director under Barack Obama. I think back in Obama's early term, but that fell through because Obama felt he was a too controversial figure. He was also floated around to potentially join the Trump administration, but that never came to fruition either. So all in all, he's a pretty interesting figure, and I think what's most interesting about him is the position that he occupies in history as it pertains to populism and to the sort of populism that has taken over America today.
Yeah, populism, because it focuses, populism is called a thin ideology by some. media theorists or scholars because like it removes the systemic critique oftentimes. Populists like there's the people who are good and the populace represents, and there's the elite who are bad and corrupt and evil. And populism often doesn't explain the elite. Like the elite are bad because they're bad. It's not that like capitalism or globalism or these interlocking forces underneath cause the elite to be a problem. And because of that, a lot of populists rely really heavily on conspiracy as a way of linking their ideology together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. RFK occupies a very specific time in history. I think, post pandemic America is a very traumatized America and a very distrustful America, in large part because the reaction to the pandemic uh, from the federal government was in a lot of ways driven um, by economics. It was driven by the desire to see people get back to work, even though we knew fully well that, the effects of COVID were, um, the effects of COVID were horrible. And so the mistrust that the public has towards these health institutions is not a mistrust that is fabricated. It's not a mistrust that is being um, that's being created. It's a mistrust that stretches back all the way to the beginning of the early 2000s when the pharmaceutical companies were telling doctors that OxyContin was not, or actually the 90s, when the pharmaceutical companies were telling the doctors that OxyContin was a non-addictive drug. They were deliberately misleading doctors, um, or maybe not even deliberately misleading doctors, but doctoring research that said that this harmful, highly addictive um, painkiller was not addictive, and as we know now, we have an opioid crisis that's ravaging middle America, ravaging younger men, and it's so the distrust that he's sort of appealing to is a real distrust. It's not fabricated. Um,
I mean, populists play on existing animosity. Populists in a time where people trust all the institutions, they're just the crazy guy in the corner. It's only when people are cynical enough that they do believe that the people who control society, the elites, the journalists, the politicians, the businessmen, it's only when they distrust them and view them as sort of anathema to America that the populace gains any power at all.
Now, this is a discussion that Fowler and I had. You remember, Fowler, when I said to you that I wasn't sure if RFK was a true believer. Could you, I guess, explain more about the concept of what a true believer is in relation to populism?
Yeah, there are some populists who 100% believe in their framing. The people they view as the elite, they actually view as the problem in society, and they view themselves unironically as vessels of the people. But there are some populists who pretend to be um, lower class or commoner in a way that they actually don't identify. Like Boris Johnson is a good example of that. And there are also populists who deliberately scapegoat elites or others in a way that they understand is scapegoating and they don't believe in it. Like George Wallace, who didn't really believe African Americans were the primary threat. He just used blacks as a way of building political power for himself.
Yeah, and
So,
so, oh, I'm sorry, Fowler, keep going.
and so Arda and I have really been debating how much Kennedy really believes in what he says. I lean towards him believing it because Kennedy has said so many outrageous things that I feel like if he was a proper grifter, he would be saying things that like are kind of public sentiment. He wouldn't be kind of going out on the line on some of the things he's decided to do because all it does is hurt him politically.
Yeah, I did some research into his background, and a lot of the vaccine stuff was he only got into the vaccine stuff, um, 10, 15 years ago, and then it kind of became compounded with COVID-19. There was a market for his sort of vaccine skepticism, um, that propelled him to the national stage, um, which I think is really interesting. It kind of goes to show that context makes the man.
Hmm. Totally.
So, Fowler is the populist expert here. I actually am not too knowledgeable about populism. So, right, I know what populism is, and I'm knowledgeable about populism, but the expert on populism and populist rhetoric is most definitely Fowler. So, Fowler, I'm going to give the floor to you and let you just, preach to the people if you know what I'm talking about.
So populism is a really complicated issue because of honestly a lot of classism. A lot of the early populists or people who studied populism and mass movements like Le Bon or Freud, they viewed the they viewed the people as inherently irrational, and they viewed like the people coming together as a kind of a very scary event of them being driven by their worst impulses, being irrational, being violent. And so in like the early conception of populism in like the 18 and 1900s, you know, the populist leader is a demagogue. He's a monster who deliberately flames bigotries and, basically ignores real debate and rationality by only appealing to the worst types of people, and the people themselves are only an agent of self-destruction. They're not capable of building anything. And now it's a much more complicated affair. There's still a lot of theorists who basically view populists that way, in that very negative way. But we've had mass movements at this point, like the civil rights movement or the progressive movement right now, where great things were achieved by populists, and a lot of people are more nuanced about it now. So, the question is like, is populist positive or negative? And then can it be channeled effectively for anything useful? And RFK is sort of, I think he's the embodiment of what the naysayers are afraid of, which is like a populist who takes common distrust and magnifies it. And then, instead of really pointing out real problems in society and providing a lens to analyze the world, instead relies on conspiracy as a way of linking a lot of disparate things together that really don't belong together and making them malevolent.
Um, I think one of the issues, and this is at least based on my assessment of RFK that I've seen, is that a lot of the issues that RFK points out are issues that are real and issues that are tangible. So, for example, talking about the surge in antidepressants being prescribed to people, the surge in, I believe there was a study that came out a couple months ago that has shown that essentially our life expectancy is decreasing in large part because of, pollution, obesity, health problems, the drug crisis, all of these different things. It's actually decreasing the average life expectancy in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Um, so I wouldn't go as far as to say that RFK is pointing out problems that are not real to distract from the true enemy. What I would say is that he is taking real problems and then drawing dubious conclusions. Does that make any sense?
I think maybe I would reframe my argument because I agree with you that like the pharmaceutical companies and like the government agencies that he points out have like historically discriminated against people or been malicious. Um, but I think within the context of a post COVID world, it's a particularly insidious thing to do because like we need people to be vaccinated for us to recover from the pandemic. And like having people turn against these medical institutions is just an extremely dangerous thing given how interconnected everything is under globalism. We could have another pandemic that could just devastate every country in the world. And people like RFK make that possibility more likely by scaring people off.
Yeah, or not even so much scaring people off, I think, but causing people to draw conclusions to issues that are very real, but that lead them away from finding the ideal solutions. You know what I mean?
What would you say is a ideal solution instead of RFK's?
Rephrase that one more time.
Like, what would you say is a more responsible solution to RFK's like perception?
Well, I think if you're going to point out, um, if you're going to point out the prevalence of, or that the pharmaceutical companies and the medical industry is, very quick to prescribe antidepressants for, um, say, like depression and mental issues, I think the correct response is to say, hey, if you want to fix this, the correct goal is not to necessarily demonize the doctors and the medical industry, but to instead essentially pass laws and pass policies that benefit people so that they don't have to go on these antidepressants and these drugs.
Mm,
You know what I mean?
yeah, that makes sense.
And I think, I think another really good example of this would be his commentary about atrazine, that he made on the Joe Rogan podcast about how atrazine is essentially, or it's a pesticide. It's a very, 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 very common pesticide that's used in our on our crops, and it's been found to cause all sorts of problems in animals and I believe humans as well. RFK talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast. He proposed that the use of atrazine you know on our crops is what's causing the rise of people identifying as transgender,
I didn't know that.
which is a very and which is a very wide sort of leap to come to when we don't have any particular data at the moment to suggest that. And on top of that, whether or not there is atrazine in on our crops that is causing a rise in gender dysphoria has no bearing on the laws currently being passed against transgender individuals in the United States.
I think one of the problems of conspiracy in general is the conspiracy can always get larger, right? If you have a conspiracy and you find evidence that the conspiracy isn't true, you can always be like, well, that's the conspiracy. It's a conspiracy that there isn't evidence of the conspiracy. And you can always expand the conspiracy further and say, like, people who don't agree with the conspiracy or people who are like bystanders, they're also part of it. And I think that's one of the big dangers of conspiracy. One is it can always become like a larger conspiracy, so it's a unfalsifiable claim. And the
Yeah,
second thing is conspiracies can really poison the legitimacy of democracy in general. They like if you convince the public that huge swaths of the American society and institutions are malicious and malevolent and are doing things to achieve these like weird esoteric goals, well, you can cause people to check out of democracy, and you can cause people to respond with hostility towards institutions that are necessary for a healthy democracy to survive.
yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's and I think RFK's appeal also has to do with the fact that he is a Kennedy and he does have a very strong track record, for the things that he's accomplished in his life. Um, I definitely don't think that the man is a grifter when it comes to environmentalism and caring about climate change. I mean, he's been prosecuting corporations for pollution for 30 years. I think the issue with RFK is like what I said, where I think it's very difficult and very dangerous as a politician to present data and then to draw conclusions about that data that haven't been substantiated by more data. We also do know that he has misinterpreted and potentially intentionally lied about vaccine data, particularly about the levels of mercury in vaccines.
You would know this better than me, Ardot. Does RFK have like medical training or whatever? I know he went to law school, but I don't know, like, is he actually an expert in the field?
From what I understand, no. His primary field is law.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Um, Let me double check that though and make sure because I don't want to present incorrect information.
Although there are people who do conspiracies in spite having expertise, like I believe his name is Andrew Wakefield. He's sort of the founder of the vaccines cause autism in kids, and he was a doctor who used his reputation and his credentials as a way to lie to the public and create conspiracy about them, the vaccines causing autism. So, even if RFK did have that expertise, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not being conspiratorial.
Yeah, I think that, and I think one of the dangers too is, he, looking at his education, he went to Harvard. He got his bachelor's from Harvard. He studied at the London School of Economics and the University of Virginia and Pace University. Um, and I think it's kind of like what you just said, Fowler, where, I would imagine, based on the sort of education that he has, the figures that he's surrounded by are people who are highly, highly educated. But like what you just said, just because you're highly educated doesn't necessarily mean that you, even if you're in the field of health, in the field of public health, um, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't also draw conclusions from data. Um,
Mm.
and I would imagine, someone like RFK, who is in the upper echelons in terms of who he interacts with, the sorts of people that he's probably surrounded with, who he's met over the years while pursuing his education and while practicing law. Um, you know, and then not to mention the sort of, the tragedies that he's had happen in his life with his father and with his uncle. It doesn't strike me that he is prone to conspiracy. He's also, putting the vaccine stuff aside, he's also made claims that the CIA assassinated both his father and his uncle, um, and you know, that the CIA is a illegitimate evil organization. Um,
His part of the reason why he probably thinks the CIA did that is JFK famously was thinking about, like, I don't know if he wanted to end the CIA, but he was thinking about cutting them back and regulating them more right around the time he died. This is
yeah,
obviously a conspiracy, but that is the history of it.
yeah. Um, so it doesn't surprise me that he's gone down that path. Um, and I am, whether or not he's a true believer, we have yet to see because you know, um, he's not in the White House yet. But um, and I think it'll be interesting to see if it's I also think, I mean, we talked about this yesterday, Fowler. I also don't think he's a grifter, because I think if he were a grifter, he would have run as an independent to siphon votes away from Biden. It's very interesting that he's running as a Democrat.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is quite interesting. Um, RFK is a troubling symptom, I suppose, because he does demonstrate that, like, the conspiracy theories that have been bread and butter for the Republican Party since the Tea Party. He's shown that Democratic voters are equally susceptible to it, and that a lot of Democrats are willing to be conspiratorial, if they're given the correct candidate.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's hard. My feelings are hard because I think it's like what like what you I think it's like what I said earlier about how, public health is such a difficult thing. I think we're living through a time where, you know, people are sick, not just from COVID, but just from the air we breathe, the water we drink. Um, and so I am sympathetic to a lot of his aspirations. I'm not as sympathetic to his uh, the vaccine shit, because I think that he's deliberately misinterpreted the data on the vaccines, or maybe not even deliberately misinterpreted, but maybe he's not privy to the data, I don't know. I don't know what goes on in his head, but I'm sympathetic in a way to the issues that he's pointing out, because I think the issues that he's pointing out have been neglected by the Democratic Party um, for a long time. It's just the conclusions that are drawn. Oh, another conspiracy he said is that Wi-Fi causes cancer. That's another claim that he's made. I am not sympathetic to the conclusions that are being drawn from his analysis of the issues. Does that make any sense?
But I think it's important to remember that like most conspiracies are based on somewhat legitimate fears. I mean, the most famous conspiracy theorist in modern American history is Joseph McCarthy, the senator who basically gained power by lying to the public and claiming that huge swaths of the entertainment industry and the government and the military were controlled by communists. And like, you know, a lot of people were afraid of the communists. It was during the Cold War. Like the Russians had taken basically all of Eastern Europe. Communism was spreading in China. So,
I
like,
want
for a
to.
conspiracy to take off, it does have to have like the fears have to be legitimate in the populace to some degree. And then the thing that makes the conspiracy theorist dangerous is he creates irrational conclusions and also heightens that fear and anger in ways that can be really deleterious for society.
I want to almost push back, but only because I want to say I think that it shows just how desperate and just how much worse society has got, that the comparison is McCarthyism. The chances that yes, people were afraid of the communists, but the chances that fucking the government and Hollywood were being controlled by communists was a damn near impossibility back at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas I think some of the things that RFK talks about are real. Like it's not that the government, or it's not that corporations aren't polluting the rivers, that they aren't causing, the third greatest mass extinction. These are all things that are actively happening right now. That the medical industry misled, doctors about Oxycontin and other prescription drugs. These are real things that happened. So I think it just shows um, the breadth of difference between. It almost reminds me. Remember when we talked about ISIS in Afghanistan and Iraq,
What about them?
about or I'm sorry, Al Qaeda, about how essentially, for those of you guys listening, the primary goal of Al Qaeda when it was originally formed was to push back aggression, or what they viewed as aggression, from Western powers.
Mm-hmm.
The formation of ISIS, so when you go and you research, what Al Qaeda believed in and what motivated them to do the sorts of things that they did, it was a very grounded reality. Pushing back against Russia, pushing back against the United States and our intervention in the Middle East broadly, not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but the broad Middle East, Middle Eastern region. Um, and as the situation degraded in a way, like as the invasion of Iraq occurred, as the invasion of Afghanistan occurred, as the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan became worse and worse and worse over the course of really 30 years, stretching all the way back to the 1990s. As the environment worsened, the conspiracies became more fanatical. And, I think in the United States, what's happening is it's become kind of a reverse where, the basis for the conspiracies have become more rooted in truth, but the conclusions have become uh more fragmented and fractured. In the Middle East,
Mm.
what ended up happening is the in the Middle East, what ended up happening is that, ISIS emerged, and ISIS, they were completely removed from the original goal of Al Qaeda, which was a pushback against Western aggression, and instead they believed in the end times. Basically, they believed it was like a death cult. Uh, they had no rational basis for their upset. They burnt the poppy seeds because they truly believed that selling poppy was against the Quran, whereas Al Qaeda was smart enough to say, hey, like, yes, the Quran says we can't sell drugs, but like we fucking need these poppies to fund our armies. So we kind of have to sell them. It's almost like
Yeah,
an example of the true believer, you know?
I think it's a really interesting point you bring up, and I think it's one of the problems with lying to the public is like if you lie to the public enough, even if the movement begins with the people in control knowing that it's a lie, like if you indoctrinate enough people into believing those fears, eventually leadership will also believe it. And I think you can see that with the Southern strategy, where it was basically a way for the Republican Party to gain power by appealing to racial resentments in white Americans. And the early Southern strategy wielders, like not to say they weren't racist, but like their main goals were economic. The racism was just a way of gaining power. But over time, the Tea Party and the MAGA movement, that racism has become the point. And we now have leaders like Donald Trump or Steve Bannon, where it's not like, it's not like before where it's a cynical way of pulling in voters while appealing to other goals. The racism is the point. And I think that's very true of conspiracy theories in general, that at a certain point, it doesn't matter whether they believe or not um, because if enough of their people believe it, then eventually there will be an actual true believer who runs that movement.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate because, often, like I think with RFK, I think I think why people like him and why he's appealing to people is in part because he's a Kennedy. And I think it's in part too because he knows how to talk to people. I think this is one issue that the Democratic Party has, is that the Democratic Party at this point has become completely divorced from, you know, like that you have to make people want to vote for you, and you have to know how to talk to working people. You have to know how to talk to people on the ground. And I think younger progressive Democrats are really good at this. But I think the Biden generation, the Pelosi generation, and the Joe Manchin generation, they've just completely lost that ability. And I think RFK, and Marianne Williamson as well, but both of those candidates know how to talk to people. And part of, I think, knowing how to talk to people, when it comes to political strategy, is in a weird way acknowledging that their fears are valid, acknowledging that the fears that they have are real. And I think RFK knows that people have fears. He knows that people were devastated by the pandemic, and that people were skeptical of the vaccines, um, in large part because a lot of people just don't understand how the science works. You know, vaccines take a long time to develop. The fact that they were able to pump out the COVID vaccine in a year is, I would imagine to some people is a bit scary. Um, but that's what they wanted. That's what we had to do. I mean, I don't know what other choice, like what we would be like. It's really insane to me. I mean, if imagine back during the Spanish flu, um, they had pumped out a vaccine in a year. I mean, I don't know. I don't think they really had vaccines during the Spanish flu, but imagine if during the Spanish flu, science had rallied together to pump out a vaccine in such a short period of time. I mean, in any other scenario, this would have been celebrated as a feat of science, as a remarkable ability of the scientific community and of the medical community to come together and accomplish something that literally has never been accomplished before, and potentially save millions and millions of people.
Hmm.
You know what I
Yeah, I
mean?
think that's true. Yeah, I think that's very true.
But I think just America has degraded, and I'm not trying to be negative when I say this. I don't mean that, like I don't mean it in like a morbid way. I think I'm talking mostly about the institutions, our institutions, and our society has degraded to a degree that people are mistrustful, and um, RFK is acknowledging fears that the mainstream Democratic Party is kind of too afraid to touch with a 10-foot pole. Um, and
In
that
a
can be
sense, I
good, but it can also be very, very dangerous if you don't have the right type of solution.
yes, because the most famous demagogue and the most successful demagogue in world history is Adolf Hitler. Not to bring Hitler into it, but he is the embodiment of everything that people who are afraid of populists are afraid of. Not to say that RFK is Hitler, but
Yeah. And now I will say too, like to that point, I think, I think there are things about RFK that I think the media has also blown out of proportion. Um, I mean, Fowler and I also talked about how, it is dangerous to be. I mean, I saw an article, I think it was from Salon the other day, that said that RFK is the greatest threat to democracy, which is not true. Uh,
in a sense, I think the media and populists both have the weakness of sensationalism. Like the populist exaggerates the power of their opponents, and they exaggerate the crisis of the country, because the more things are in crisis, the more likely people are to abandon conventional politicians or parties and vote for the outsider candidate. And the
yeah,
media has the same problem, where in order to get eyes on their papers and in order to like get sell copies, they like making everything catastrophic benefits them. And so it creates this situation where the media and the various populist figures, they like in a circular sense build up greater and greater fear and intensity, because there isn't really a reason for either of them to like turn off, to have like a turn off switch. And that can create um that can terrify the populace into them doing things that are really dangerous or self-destructive, and it can erode discourse, and it can make things much more catastrophic in a way that can block like more reasonable solutions from actually fixing the situation.
yeah. Like I think the greatest threat to democracy right now is Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. I think it's the Trump, the Trump brigade. RFK has not said anything about, for all intents and purposes, his policies are more in line with mainstream, Democrats and I guess, Kennedy Democrats. He's pro, he's not anti-abortion. He's pro, I guess, affirmative action. He came out and said the other day, um, pro, or anti-military industrial complex. So I think the issue with him is his tendency to conspiracy, and it's the fact that decided to he dropped his anti-vax hot take during one of the worst pandemics in American and world history.
Yeah,
Not a
and
good
he
not a
said,
good look, Chief.
yeah, it's kind of a shame RFK has so many problems, because his father, Robert Kennedy, was like he was the future of the New Deal Democrats. He was potentially the politician who was positioned to like rebuild that working class coalition and like push the Democratic Party away from its most self-destructive tendencies, like their obsession of the war on communism and their inability to talk about race. So it's, I don't know, it's quite sad that
Yeah.
how the
He's
Kennedy family has fallen.
yeah, and it's so I think the upset for me is that like his and I'm not good. This is not me sitting here. I probably sound like I'm a Kennedy fan, and I'm not going to disclose my political preferences. But it is just disappointing to see a candidate who does have that. I mean, looking at it from a media perspective, looking at it just from a narrative perspective, who has that star power. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because Kennedy does, I think, have that star power. I think he's younger. I think he's still up there in age, but he's definitely younger. He's definitely physically fit. He has the Kennedy name. He has, he doesn't have a background in politics, which I think, Fowler and I have gone back and forth about that as a problem. He has a good track record for environmental issues and for a lot of other issues as well. And he's not, he doesn't, he's not he doesn't seem to be problematic with women, like I mean that we know of right now. He's not been me too'd, which is a big deal in 2023. Uh,
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I do think it's projection to some degree. Like I think a lot of people are desperate now that Bernie's not going to run for president
for
and he's sort of
somebody, yeah,
retiring. Yeah, they're desperate for an outsider candidate that's progressive and not problematic. And like I think in 2016 or 2020, like RFK and Marianne Williamson
they
would
would have
have
gotten
had a
like
debt.
1%.
Yeah, but now that like Biden has made all these moves to ensure that there isn't going to be a primary, and he's like scared off all the actual progressive candidates who are more serious from running. Like people are just desperate for anyone besides Trump and Biden.
Yeah,
And
and that can be people can take advantage of that, you know.
yeah, definitely.
Like I would be like if I were a candidate running, let's say it was, me, RFK, Marianne Williamson, and Biden, I would be jumping for fucking joy. I would be saying all sorts of crazy shit. I'm kidding. I would be. I'm kidding. Do not replay this in 15 years when I decide to run for office. But no, I would be saying some hellish shit. I'd be like, look, if y'all don't elect me as president of the United States, I know from classified documents we are going to be invaded by aliens in 2027.
I mean, Donald Trump kind of did that when he claimed that he had a secret solution to ending the Ukrainian war, but he wouldn't tell anyone until they made him the president.
He's like a 5-year-old. I love it. He's like, it's like you ask your child, like, what do you have in your hand? And he's like, I won't tell you until I go to sleep.
But that's
But
the same thing with a lot of them. I mean, Hitler is another great example. I think, from what I was told by a historian who studied that time period, like Hitler claimed that he was going to give like every family in Germany a car. So I'm serious. That's a real thing he did.
so you can just really say anything. And maybe that's RFK's long game. I mean, maybe he's not a true believer. You know what I mean? Maybe he just is like, yo, I know what people are pissed off about, COVID. And when I get into office, I'm not going to do any of that shit. But the scary thing about that is like if he's not a true believer about the vaccine shit, then we don't know what else he's not a true believer about.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons I'm hesitant to pick people about political experience is like the reason Bernie was such a strong candidate was because we knew Bernie's opinion about every issue from like 1960 to like 2016. And so like there wasn't a lot of chance that like Bernie gets into power and then he's just like completely pulls like a maneuver and we have no idea. And
Yeah.
I think that's the scary thing about these outsider types is like the ones that don't really have like a political record as a politician. You have no idea what they're going to do. You know, they can say whatever they want, but you don't really know what will happen when they have real power, and you don't really know what their real priorities are.
Yeah, and I think too with Kennedy, and less so with Marianne Williamson, but more so with Kennedy, is he's already, based on the tweets he's made about the CIA, he's already made an enemy of the administrative state in a lot of ways, uh, which is not really something you need to do as a political candidate. Um, which doesn't show a lot of, I guess, political savviness, you know?
He's not a politician, so it makes sense he
Yeah.
wouldn't be politically savvy. I don't
Um,
know. Out of the two of them, Marianne Williamson and RFK, I'm lean way more towards Marianne Williamson. I feel like you've said that she's polling worse, but I think she's way less problematic and like Marianne Williamson, like her big issues are like the criminal justice system and like welfare, and I would and race, and like RFK, um, just him being in the race is causing people to debate like vaccine denial in a way that I find very uncomfortable. But at least with Marianne Williamson, like her being in a race does highlight issues that are important for progressives and that it would be good to force Biden to the left on. So I think she has a utility as a protest candidate in a way that he doesn't.
yeah, I agree with you there. I'm not going to say again who my preferred candidate would be, but I agree with your assessment of Williamson. Um, I'm sad we're not getting debates. It's going to be that's we
Read
we
somewhere,
might not.
I don't know if it's been confirmed, but I read somewhere that Trump also might not debate.
Yeah, we might just
So,
not. We might just. They might as well just do it now. Like like that's how I feel about this whole situation. They might as well
well,
just say fuck it and just because.
Trump is beating Biden right now, so we
Oh,
need the time. Yeah, and some of that is not being helped by Cornel West. Like there's some polling that indicates that like Cornel West would take away enough votes from Biden that it could actually cost Biden in certain parts of the race.
don't
So
even
I
get.
don't know. Have we talked about Cornel West?
No,
Maybe
maybe
not.
we need to have an episode on Cornell West, and then maybe we can
Hmm.
have an episode on Marianne Williamson as well.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Um, because we would need. I would have to do some deep diving into Cornell West. Um,
He's a wild dude. I've known some people who went to Harvard, and he was at Harvard for a long time in African American studies. He's a Christian socialist. He's like pretty out there. He supported Bernie, um, and he's sort of, I don't know. He's kind of a controversial figure. He famously voted for Jill Stein over Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election. So, and he's part of the rise of the populist party. He's like a very unorthodox candidate, um, who's done a lot of very weird maneuvering across his career.
okay, we'll have to save an episode for Cornell West then. But we're hitting the 45-minute mark, so we got to go ahead and wrap it up. Do you have any closing words to say, Fowler?
Um, I think people should be very careful about candidates that talk more about people or groups of people than systems. I think often that's one of the hallmarks of the worst kind of populist is that they, it's the Jews, it's the blacks, it's the Muslims, it's the immigrants, you know, it's the pharmaceutical people. Like I think that's often a sign that they lean towards demagoguery. I think it's really important when you pick candidates to make sure that there's like underlying systems and there's like a narrative underneath there's like an ideology underneath the problems they're pointing out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, um, definitely agree with that. And what I would say to everybody is politics is always about trade-offs. You can't ever have everything. Uh, it's definitely a win some, you lose some game. And I think fundamentally all most politics are people deciding what they would sacrifice in order to gain something.
Hmm.
But the problem is oftentimes, that it's easier to dismantle a system than it is to build one up. It's easier to, it's easier to take away something than it is to give people something. Especially when what you're giving people is something that's never been created before. You know. Um, so I would say I always advise people to be careful about and really know what it is they feel like they'd be willing to sacrifice because you're always going to sacrifice something when it comes to politics, and it's about what you care about more.
Hmm.
You know, do I care more about certain environmental issues, or do I care more about having a functioning and useful um, uh, medical or pharmaceutical industry? You know, like you have to make that trade off, and you just gotta always be sure that you're making the right one. Uh, but that's what I'd say about that. I don't know if you have any disagreements or agreements, Fowler.
I think when we live in a time where we have less shit candidates, we will have to choose that stuff less.
Yeah,
The problem is we haven't had a good progressive candidate besides Bernie in like it's been since LBJ probably. So we've had to make a lot of hard choices, but I'm hopeful and optimistic of a time when it's not when politics is not picking between the shiniest of two turds.
yeah,
I'm excited for that era.
yeah. I can't wait, bro. We don't have to pick shit one and shit two. But thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like, leave a comment, and definitely subscribe for more episodes. We will see you guys in the next video.